Story 1. The Woman in White. Ethan adjusted the rearview mirror as he drove down the quiet rural highway. It was late, and the moonlight barely penetrated the heavy cloud cover, casting shadows that danced across the road like fleeting phantoms. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through the trees lining the highway. He had taken this detour to reach a small town for a work assignment, but his GPS had given out hours ago, leaving him at the mercy of the winding, unfamiliar roads. Just a few more miles, he muttered to himself, fighting off the exhaustion creeping into his bones. A cup of coffee would have helped, but there hadn't been a gas station in sight for miles, and he was starting to regret the decision to press on into the night. As he navigated a particularly dark stretch of the highway, Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 11:47 p.m. Great, he thought. Just me and the woods. The trees loomed on either side, their branches swaying like gnarled fingers, and he could almost feel them closing in. Suddenly, something caught his eye, a flash of white just off the road. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. Standing there was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her hair cascading down her shoulders like a waterfall of moonlight. Ethan's heart raced, and he instinctively pressed down on the gas pedal. As he drove past, he stole a glance at her face, but it was obscured by shadows. In a blink, she disappeared into the darkness, as if she had never been there. What the hell was that? He breathed, his heart pounding in his chest. Shaking off the encounter, he told himself it was just a trick of the light or a figment of his overactive imagination. After all, it was late, and he was exhausted. He focused on the road ahead, hoping to put the encounter behind him. A few minutes later, he saw the silhouette of a barn in the distance, illuminated by the faint glow of a weathered sign. The town must be nearby, he thought, relief flooding over him. But as he turned his gaze back to the road, he saw her again, the woman in white, standing eerily close to the edge of the asphalt. This time, her gaze was fixed on him, and a chill shot through Ethan's spine. He accelerated, desperate to escape the unsettling vision. The figure lingered in his rearview mirror, always just behind him, her presence an inescapable shadow. The further he drove, the more he felt her eyes boring into him, as if she were compelling him to stop. "What is wrong with me?" he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The radio began to crackle, and for a moment he thought he heard a soft, mournful tune. He fiddled with the knobs, but the static only intensified, filling the car with a disconcerting hiss. Ethan's thoughts raced. Was he losing it? Was fatigue finally getting to him? Just then, another flash of white caught his eye. He turned, and there she was again, closer this time, standing still as a statue, her features becoming clearer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her long hair floated around her face like a ghostly veil, and her eyes, empty, haunting, seemed to pull him in. "I have to get out of here," he said aloud, panic rising within him. He pressed the accelerator, the car responding with a growl, but even as he sped away, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right behind him. As the road twisted and turned, Ethan's unease only deepened. He glanced at the clock again. It was now 11:55 p.m. "Just keep driving," he whispered to himself, but the woman's presence lingered like a dark cloud. The air inside the car grew colder, and he shivered, glancing out the window again. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and he could almost hear their whispers, urging him to stop. Suddenly, he felt it, a distinct presence in the car, an inexplicable heaviness that settled over him like a shroud. The radio crackled louder, a static-filled cacophony that drowned out the sound of the engine. His heart raced as he glanced into the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty backseat. But then he saw it, the fleeting glimpse of her reflection, pale and translucent, hovering just behind him. "Get a grip, Ethan," he yelled at himself, gripping the wheel tighter. But as he fought to regain control of his thoughts, the headlights flickered and dimmed, plunging the interior of the car into shadow. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, he heard it. A whisper, soft and ethereal, drifting from the back seat. "Take me home." The word sent a jolt of ice through his veins, and Ethan's blood ran cold. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the back seat remained empty, the shadows deepening around him. Panic surged as he swerved the car to the side of the road, desperately trying to calm his racing heart. "This isn't real," he told himself. "It can't be." But the woman's voice echoed in his mind, haunting and insistent. "Take me home." Suddenly the headlights flickered back on, illuminating the road ahead. Ethan looked up just in time to see the woman in white standing directly in front of his car. Her face was clearer now, twisted in a silent scream, and Ethan's heart dropped. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he fought to regain control. The car skidded to a stop, narrowly missing her. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the figure before him. She stood there, unmoving, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. He felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. In that moment, something shifted in the air, and the temperature dropped. The woman began to walk toward him, gliding across the ground as if she were floating. Ethan fumbled for the door handle, ready to escape the car, but the words echoed in his mind, "Take me home." Before he could react, he slammed the car into reverse and sped backward, heart racing. He didn't care where he went, he just needed to get away from her. The headlights illuminated the trees as he veered off the road, narrowly avoiding the ditch. As he turned around to head back in the direction he had come from, he saw her standing by the road, her expression now one of sadness rather than anger. Ethan's mind raced as he turned back onto the highway, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her still following him, but she had vanished, leaving only darkness behind. "I need to get to a town," he thought, desperate for safety. He pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as he raced down the desolate road. With every passing second, he felt the weight of her presence lifting, though the memory of her haunting voice lingered in his mind. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally saw the distant lights of a small town breaking through the darkness. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the first gas station he saw, the familiar sight of civilization grounding him. He parked and took a deep breath, attempting to steady his racing heart. Inside the gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow. He approached the cashier, an older man with a scruffy beard and weary eyes. "Hey, do you know this area well?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Been living here for years," the man replied, eyeing Ethan curiously. "Why do you ask?" "I saw something on the road," Ethan began, hesitating. "A woman in white. She kept appearing, and then I heard her voice," she said. The cashier's face was drained of color. "The woman in white," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the first to see her. They say she haunts that stretch of highway, looking for someone to take her home. She died years ago, waiting for someone who never came." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, the weight of the man's words crashing over him like a wave. The memory of the woman's hollow gaze and her desperate plea echoed in his mind, bringing with it an overwhelming sense of dread. "Why do people still drive that road?" Ethan asked, feeling the walls of the station closing in on him. "It's the only route through these woods. Just be careful if you go back that way," the cashier warned, his eyes narrowing. "You might not be so lucky next time." Ethan nodded, his thoughts racing. The weight of what he had experienced pressed down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter was far from over. As he stepped back outside, the chill in the air reminded him of the woman, her voice still lingering in the recesses of his mind. From that night on, Ethan avoided the rural highway at all costs. The memory of the woman in white would haunt him, a ghostly reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the open road. Whenever he drove through the night, he would glance nervously into the rearview mirror, always expecting to see her staring back at him, waiting for someone to take her home. Story 2. The Phantom Truck. The road stretched out like a black ribbon beneath the pale light of the moon. Mark glanced at the clock on his dashboard. It was past midnight, and he was nearing the end of a long, exhausting business trip. The highway was desolate, with only the occasional rustle of leaves echoing through the night. He rubbed his tired eyes and turned the radio dial, hoping for something to keep him alert. A static-filled broadcast broke through, but it did little to lift his spirits. Just as he began to lose himself in thought, Mark noticed a pair of headlights approaching fast in his rearview mirror. He shrugged it off at first, but as the vehicle drew closer, his unease grew. The truck was massive, its front grille looming ominously behind him. He pressed down on the accelerator, trying to increase the distance, but the truck kept pace, as if it were toying with him. His heart raced as he glanced back again. The truck's headlights felt like piercing eyes, glaring at him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Just my imagination, he told himself, but the fear gnawed at him. Mark felt the pressure building in his chest, the relentless presence of the truck amplifying his anxiety. No matter how fast he drove, the truck was right behind him, a shadow lurking in the night. Mark could feel sweat gathering at the nape of his neck. He had long since left the city behind, and the surrounding woods were closing in, creating an isolated cocoon that felt both suffocating and claustrophobic. Every flicker of the headlights made the hairs on his arms stand on end. With each mile, the truck's aggressive following transformed from a mere inconvenience into a primal terror. Mark made a split-second decision. He couldn't keep driving like this. He spotted a dimly lit rest area up ahead, and without hesitating, he turned in. Maybe he could confront the driver, demand to know what was going on, or at least catch his breath without the oppressive weight of that truck looming behind him. The rest area was eerily quiet. A few flickering lights cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, and the distant chirping of crickets filled the silence. Mark parked his car and stepped out, taking the moment to collect himself. The cool night air bit at his skin, a refreshing contrast to the heat of his anxiety. He turned to see if the truck had followed him in. To his surprise, the truck was nowhere to be seen. A wave of relief washed over him, and he took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. But that relief was short-lived, as a nagging feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. It was as if he could still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. He turned back toward the rest area, eyeing the darkened picnic tables scattered around. What a weird night, he muttered to himself, shaking off the lingering dread. But before he could make his way back to the car, a low rumble shattered the silence. Mark spun around, and his breath caught in his throat. There, parked beside him, was the same truck that had been tailing him. But something was off. The paint was chipped, and the tires looked flat, as if it had been parked there for years. The headlights were off, but the truck loomed in the darkness, its presence feeling like a curse on the night. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his heart racing once again. He cautiously approached the truck, curiosity battling against fear. The driver's side door hung ajar, creaking gently in the wind. He peered inside, half expecting the driver to leap out and confront him. But the cab was empty. The interior was coated in dust, the dashboard cracked and faded. Old newspapers littered the passenger seat, yellowed with age. One caught his eye, the headline blurred but unmistakable: "Mysterious Disappearance on Highway 47. A chill ran down his spine as he reached for the paper. The date was decades old, and the story detailed how a driver had vanished without a trace one fateful night. Mark's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. The images showed the same truck, parked ominously by the side of the road. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff, looking into a dark abyss, the depths of which he dared not explore. Suddenly he heard a noise behind him, a faint rustle in the bushes. Mark spun around, heart pounding. The shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, but nothing was there. Just the stillness of the night enveloping him once more. "Get it together," he muttered, forcing himself to focus. He took a deep breath and stepped back from the truck. Just as he did, the wind shifted, and he felt a sudden drop in temperature. Goosebumps rose on his arms as he turned to look back at the truck. It felt alive, breathing, as if the air around it had thickened with an unseen presence. Mark's pulse quickened. It was time to leave. He turned back toward his car, but before he could take a step, the truck's engine roared to life, startling him. He spun around, eyes wide with terror, as the headlights flickered on, illuminating the rest area with an eerie glow. "Hello?" he called out, but his voice cracked in the cold air. There was no answer, only the low hum of the engine and the relentless pounding of his heart. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint but chilling, echoing through the night. "Help me." The voice was soft and ghostly, a plea that set through him. Mark took a step back, feeling a cold sweat form on his brow. He could see shadows moving in the corners of his vision, dancing just beyond the reach of the light. Panic surged through him as he stumbled backward, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But he was rooted to the spot, caught in a web of fear and confusion. With a surge of adrenaline, he bolted back toward his car, but the shadows closed in around him. He glanced over his shoulder to see the truck's headlights brightening, casting an otherworldly glow. In that moment, Mark caught sight of a figure standing beside the truck, a woman, her face pale and ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. She stood there, silently staring at him, her expression twisted in sorrow. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a haunting melody. "Help me," she repeated, and the words echoed in his mind, wrapping around him like a vise. He jumped into his car, heart racing, fumbling with the keys in his trembling hands. "Start, damn it!" he shouted, panic overtaking him as he turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, refusing to come to life. The headlights of the truck flickered ominously, and the woman stepped closer, her form growing clearer. She raised her hand, pointing at him. A finger curled as if beckoning him to come closer. The darkness enveloped him, and he felt as if he were being pulled toward her against his will. "Please help me." Her voice grew more frantic, echoing through the night, and Mark's fear morphed into sheer terror. He banged on the steering wheel in desperation, willing the car to start, glancing at the rearview mirror to see the figure inches away from him. In a final act of desperation, he turned the key once more. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. Tires screeched against the pavement as he tore away from the rest area, glancing in the mirror to see the woman standing in the headlights, her face twisted in a mix of grief and anger. He sped down the highway, the night blurring past him, but the feeling of being hunted clung to him like a shadow. The truck's ghostly silhouette loomed in his mind, the whispers fading into the distance. Yet the image of the woman haunted him, her outstretched hand forever etched in his memory. As Mark drove on, he tried to shake off the nightmare he had just escaped. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow on the road ahead, but the fear lingered like a bitter aftertaste. What had he encountered? Was it just a figment of his overworked imagination, or had he brushed against something truly sinister? His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he took deep breaths to calm himself. The rhythmic thump of his heart began to slow, but the images remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, even in the solitude of the highway. When he finally reached the familiar sights of civilization, Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. He pulled into a gas station, the bright lights flooding the area, but he couldn't shake the sensation that the phantom truck was still lurking in the shadows. Years would pass, but Mark would never forget that night. He would avoid that rest area at all costs and share his story with anyone willing to listen. Every time he drove at night, he would glance nervously in the rearview mirror, always half expecting to see the headlights of the phantom truck bearing down on him, ready to claim its next victim. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind howled through the trees and the shadows danced in the darkness, he would hear the whispers echoing in the corners of his mind. "Help me." Story 3. The lurker at the gas station. Dave had been driving for hours, and the clock on his dashboard glowed a ghostly 1:32 a.m. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt that seemed to vanish into the darkness. He had just crossed into a remote area where the tall trees loomed like sentinels, and the only company he had was the soft hum of his car's engine. He desperately needed to refuel, but the rest stops had become increasingly scarce. Just when he was starting to doubt he would find another gas station, he spotted a flickering neon sign up ahead, "Gas Go." He pulled into the gravel lot, his headlights illuminating the old gas pumps and the ramshackle building that housed the convenience store. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Dust clung to the windows, and the paint was peeling in patches, revealing the weathered wood beneath. The flickering lights only added to the eerie ambience, casting long shadows across the ground. As he stepped out of the car, a chill ran down his spine, the night air feeling heavier than before. He shook off the feeling, attributing it to exhaustion, and made his way toward the entrance. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with outdated snacks and stale air. The only other presence was the attendant, a middle-aged man with graying hair and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold more secrets than Dave could fathom. "Can I help you?" the attendant asked, his voice gravelly, as he leaned against the counter, watching Dave with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Just here for gas," Dave replied, trying to maintain a casual tone. "Fill her up," the man said, pointing toward the pumps outside. "But be quick about it." Dave felt an odd tension in the air as he made his way back to the pump. He filled the tank while glancing back at the attendant, who was now watching him through the window. There was something unsettling about the man's demeanor, as if he were waiting for something to happen. After paying, Dave turned to leave, but the attendant called out, "Hold on a minute, son. You might want to know something." Dave hesitated, feeling the unease creep back into his mind. "What's that?" "There's a presence around here. People have been followed out of this area. You might not want to stick around too long," Hank said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. "What do you mean, a presence?" Dave asked, feigning nonchalance, but a knot formed in his stomach. "Just stories, but they say something lurks in the shadows, waiting for its chance to catch up with you. I had a customer once filled up and left. Never came back. Just vanished." Dave chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, man, it's just a gas station late at night. You can't believe that stuff." Hank's expression didn't change. "You might want to take it seriously. Just keep your eyes open." With that cryptic warning hanging in the air, Dave thanked him and hurried back to his car, shaking off the feeling of dread. He started the engine, and as he pulled away from the gas station, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The attendant stood at the entrance, watching him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. As he drove onto the highway, the road felt even darker. The trees closed in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, creating shadows that danced in the periphery of his vision. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy above, and the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of his tires against the pavement. For the first few minutes he tried to push Hank's warnings from his mind, but as he continued driving, an unsettling sensation crept over him, a feeling that he was not alone. He glanced at his mirrors frequently, convinced he saw movement in the shadows. The trees seemed to lean closer, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but his heart raced, and paranoia began to seep into his thoughts. What if Hank's warning had been true? What if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike? As he drove further down the winding road, Dave spotted a shadow darting between the trees, just out of reach of his headlights. His heart raced, and he instinctively pressed the accelerator, urging his car to go faster. But the feeling of being watched only intensified, a weight pressing down on him, as if the very night had come alive with unseen eyes. He tried to convince himself that it was just the dark playing tricks on him, but doubt gnawed at his mind. He glanced at the fuel gauge, just below half a tank, and considered turning back to the gas station for reassurance. But the thought of returning to that dimly lit place filled him with dread. Suddenly, Dave heard a rustling noise from behind him, like footsteps crunching on gravel. He glanced in his rearview mirror again, but all he saw was the empty stretch of road behind him. Panic began to rise in his throat. Maybe it was just an animal, he told himself. Or maybe he was just being paranoid. Then, without warning, his car sputtered and jolted violently. The engine began to cough, and the headlights flickered ominously. "No, no, no," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel as the power. He managed to pull over to the side of the road, just as the engine died completely, plunging him into darkness. He sat there for a moment, his heart racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The night was utterly silent, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. The darkness pressed against the windows, and Dave felt a wave of claustrophobia wash over him. Panic rose in his chest as he fumbled for his phone, praying for a signal. But as he glanced at the screen, his heart sank. It was dead. "Great," he whispered to himself, frustration mingling with fear. Just as he was about to step out of the car, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was shrouded in shadow, too dark to make out any features, but he could feel its presence bearing down on him, watching. Dave's breath quickened, and his instincts screamed at him to get away. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The figure remained still, and Dave squinted, trying to discern any movement. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, stepping into the dim light cast by his car's headlights. It was a gaunt silhouette, its face obscured by a hood. Dave felt a chill crawl up his spine, and he instinctively locked the doors, his heart pounding in his chest. "Get away from me," he shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. The figure paused for a moment, as if contemplating its next move, and then it broke into a slow, deliberate walk toward the car. Fear gripped Dave, and he fumbled for the ignition, willing the engine to come back to life. But nothing happened, just a disheartening silence. As the figure drew closer, Dave could see its hollow eyes glinting in the light, an empty void that sent shivers racing through him. It reached a hand toward the car, long, bony fingers outstretched, and Dave screamed, "Leave me alone." With a surge of adrenaline, he flung open the door and bolted into the trees. The darkness enveloped him, branches scratching at his skin as he plunged deeper into the woods. He could hear the rustling behind him, the sound of something pursuing him, a low, guttural growl echoing through the night. He ran blindly, heart pounding in his ears, branches snapping underfoot. The sensation of being hunted was overwhelming, a primal fear that urged him to escape. He stumbled through the underbrush, gasping for breath as he fought against the encroaching darkness. "Please, please, let me find my way out," he whispered to himself, the panic threatening to consume him. As he ran, the shadows seemed to close in around him, and the whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind. The trees felt alive, twisting and reaching, as if trying to entangle him in their grasp. He could hear it behind him, the figure moving with an unnatural grace, almost gliding through the shadows. Then, just as he thought he couldn't run any longer, he burst into a small clearing, moonlight spilling onto the ground like silver. He stopped, breathless, and turned to look back. The figure was gone. Had he lost it? Was he safe? But before he could catch his breath, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A car approaching down a nearby road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Desperation surged through him. He turned and ran toward the light, his heart racing with hope. As he stumbled onto the side of the road, waving his arms, the car slowed down and pulled over. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, rolled down the window. "Hey, are you okay?" "Please, I need help." Dave gasped, glancing back into the darkness, half expecting to see the figure emerge from the shadows. The driver looked him over, eyes widening. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Get in." Without hesitation, Dave climbed into the passenger seat, relief flooding through him. The driver immediately pressed the gas pedal, and they sped away from the clearing. As they drove, Dave finally caught his breath, trying to explain the terror he had just experienced. There was something following me. I stopped at a gas station, and the attendant warned me. The driver nodded, glancing over at him. Yeah, I've heard stories about that place. Folks say there's something wrong with it, something that lingers. Just as Dave was about to respond, the driver's expression shifted. He turned to Dave with an unsettling smile. You shouldn't have left the gas station, kid. Confusion washed over Dave. What do you mean? The driver's eyes darkened, and he leaned closer. You see, once you've been marked by the lurker, you can never truly escape. It will follow you home. A cold wave of realization crashed over Dave as he understood the implications of the driver's words. His heart sank, dread pooling in the pit of his stomach. He was still being hunted, even in this car. The world outside blurred as they sped along the road, but the suffocating sense of fear remained, the whispers echoing in his mind. He knew deep down that the nightmare was far from over. As they continued driving into the night, the moonlight faded, leaving only shadows behind. The lingering dread of the lurker was a presence he could never shake, a darkness that would follow him long after he left the gas station. And as the driver laughed softly, the sound echoed in the empty night. Dave realized he had entered a new reality, a world where fear lurked around every corner, waiting for its chance to claim him. He had become just another story, a cautionary tale whispered among weary travelers. The night was no longer just dark, it was alive, teeming with dangers he could barely comprehend. In that moment he understood the truth. He would never truly be free. The lurker had marked him, and it was only a matter of time before it came for him again.